Hi, it's Ray Grant. It is Saturday, May 9th, 2026. It is 5:24 p.m. here in Pittsburgh. This is a follow-up video to my previous video about the Z408 mailing, and I've made various notes for myself in an attempt to be a little bit more concise here on the video. The previous video was actually recorded on my birthday, April 29th. And it took me a week and a half because there was a hit and run driver who I was in my living room about, I guess it was 10 days ago or so, and I heard a crash out on the street. And my next door neighbor texted me a minute later and said that a van had driven by and knocked the driver's side mirror off my car. And I was going to take it to the dealership, but I didn't want to drive on the Pittsburgh Parkway without a mirror. So I was able to find a local auto repair shop that was able to do it. But various distractions kept me from editing the video until yesterday, and I finally was able to put it up, I guess, overnight. So anyway, in the meantime, in the last week and a half or so, I've thought up various follow-up points for that video. And also I got a comment on Ned's channel from Druser, who asked me a couple of questions about the mailing, so I'm going to address those as well. So I'm going to try and do these as relatively quickly as possible. Okay, point number one is about extortion. If you go and look at on one of the pages of the FBI file, it mentions that the FBI received it received the teletype from naval intelligence at Mare Island. Doesn't say all that, but it mentions that the teletype message was received on August 1st, 1969. Now, one of the things that you have to remember here is the actual sequence of events dealing with Z408. In other words, who had a copy of Z408? Well, the first thing we know is that the Zodiac killer mailed copies to the three newspapers in the Bay Area: the Vallejo Times-Herald, San Francisco Examiner, San Francisco Chronicle. So, as I said in the other video, the newspapers then gave their copy of the Z408 cipher to Vallejo PD. Vallejo PD's first move after doing that, after getting the cipher, was to bring it to naval intelligence at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. Naval intelligence's first move after getting the cipher was to forward it to the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI, okay? And we know that the FBI received a transmission from naval intelligence, because you can see it right there on the FBI file online, where it talks about the teletype and the August 1st, 1969, okay? So we know that the FBI received the cipher, and we know, as I said in the other video, that Vallejo PD told Napa Sheriff's Office, when Napa Sheriff's Office actually visited Vallejo PD on October 1st after the Lake Berryessa murder, that the FBI had solved the cipher, okay? So the question then becomes, one question people might ask is, why would the FBI who you assume is fairly busy, why would the FBI suddenly drop everything that they were doing and pay attention to, a cipher that was sent to 3 newspapers in the Bay Area? Well, the main reason is this word here, extortion. If you look at the same sheet that has the dated teletype of August 1st, 1969, most of what is written on that page, it's a very bad copy, and you can't really read most of what's there. But one word that is easily readable there is the word extortion. And extortion can be a federal crime. And since in effect the 3 newspapers were being extorted by the letter writer, that he was threatening to kill large numbers of people and go on a kill rampage if they didn't respond, if they didn't put the cipher in their newspapers, so that the FBI would have dropped whatever it was doing and immediately attempted to solve the cipher. Okay, so that would have definitely speeded things up. Now, one of the points that I've made over the years, you had Thomas Horan. Every time I mentioned to him that the letter writer could have gotten away with what he did, because if he didn't commit the murders, he wouldn't have been accused of any crime. And Horan kept saying, well, he would have been accused of extortion. Okay, well, he would have been, apparently, going by the FBI's reaction, but you have to remember that that extortion has a statute of limitations. The statute of limitations for extortion as a federal crime is 5 years. So as of August the 1st, 1974, the Zodiac killer wouldn't have had to worry about being prosecuted federally. And then for the state of California, there are 2 different types of extortion. There is misdemeanor extortion and felony extortion. But even for felony extortion, the statute of limitations under the California Penal Code is 7 years. So as of August 1st, 1976, whoever wrote the letters, if he didn't do the murders, could have put out had a book published that said, I am the Zodiac killer. And if the writer didn't want the negative publicity from doing that, he could have done what the science fiction writer Alan Norse did when he was a doctor out of medical school. He wrote about his first year in a hospital, and he had a bestseller, I believe, in 1965, before he began his career as a science fiction writer. He wrote a book called Intern, and the title of the book was Intern by Dr. X. Okay, and it wasn't found out until many years later that Alan Norse was Dr. X. But whoever the writer of the Zodiac letters could have done was to say, I was the Zodiac killer by Mr. X. And the police couldn't have done anything to the publishing houses because no actual crime was committed. And the writer could have published, the solution to, the other 3 ciphers, Z340, Z13, and Z32, and whatever else he wanted to talk about. And as I said, I'm sure that the book would have sold millions of copies and probably gotten a movie deal and so forth. But for some reason that hasn't happened. And I believe the reason is that the writer was also one of the killers. Okay. So one of the urban legends that's involved with Z408 is that, number one, that the police would have just sent out the cipher to be solved by the general public. You don't see that today. You don't see when there's a police press conference for, let's say, a mass shooting. The police don't uh, tell the news, the reporters, who the shooter is. They don't tell them who the victims are at first. And the police don't reveal any information about the perpetrator until they have complete control over the situation. Okay. So that's why I say Vallejo PD wouldn't have put out the cipher until after they heard back from the federal agencies. So that's the urban legend number one. Urban legend number two is that two people, the Hardens, who had no formal training and were not even amateur cryptographers, could have outdone the federal agencies. Keep in mind that we know that the FBI solved the cipher independent of the Hardens, because that's what Vallejo PD told Napa Sheriff's Office. And once one of the federal agencies solved the cipher, the other agencies wouldn't have gone on working on it. They would have maybe checked double checked the result, but that's about it. So there would have presumably only been one of the agencies would have solved the cipher, and we know that the FBI solved it, okay? So what that tells us is that the FBI solved the cipher before the other federal agencies. I believe because of the timing of the release of the ciphers to the newspapers, that they solved Z408 that afternoon. And that takes us to the third urban legend, which is that Z408, and this is something that you see even with the professional cryptographers like Dave Aranchak, or people who are very serious cryptographers, will tend to view Z408 and Z340 as if they're similar, and they really aren't. Z340 was a transpositional cipher. I point out that Penn, who I believe was wrote all the Zodiac ciphers, Penn was a cryptographer for the Army Air Corps during World War II. And if you look at the Army Code Manual, it features the same sort of transpositional ciphers that Z340 is. In fact, I asked Dave to take a look at to take a look at the Army Code Manual, because I have a feeling that the exact format that was used for Z340 is somewhere in an Army Code Manual. It's exactly the type of transpositional scheme that the Army Code Manual has. Okay, so that's one type of cipher, but Z408 wasn't that level of cipher. It never was. What you saw in comic books of the 1940s and 1950s were the decoder ring ciphers, where somebody would send in and get a decoder ring from, a comic book or what have you, and then they could decode ciphers that were printed in the comic books. It's the same sort of thing that you see in on the puzzle pages of newspapers. You see codes. They are generally single substitution codes. They're not multiple substitutions like Z408. But keep in mind that the only thing that separates decoder ring cipher from Z408 is that as a multiple substitution cipher, the Z408 basically defeats any attempt to use letter frequencies to solve the cipher. Now, to an extent, you can still use letter frequencies, but you have to take into account that each letter or many of the letters can many of the symbols can stand for the same letter. In the case of Z408, the letter E is represented by 7 symbols. It's Z, backward P, in order. It's a repeating sequence of Z, backward P, W, the plus sign, and then O, N, E. Okay? And I believe that's probably a statement, ZPW or Z backward N, backward 9, W plus 1. Okay? So as I said, the Z408, wasn't the little brother of Z340. It was a completely different sort of cipher, and Z408 was only one step removed from just being a regular decoder ring cipher. And I will point out, as I said, when I respond to some of Drewser's questions, which is that Donald Marsh, who is the head of the American Cryptogram Association, I think it's Donald C.B. Marsh, he was given the, I believe it was the San Francisco Chronicle, gave Donald Marsh the Z408 cipher, and the newspaper gave Marsh the first 4 words of the hardened solution, which is "I like killing people." Once he had that, Marsh was able to solve the rest of the cipher in 1 hour. Okay, so then the question becomes, and I will do that in sequence, but the question becomes, how quickly could an FBI cryptographer get to the 4 words, "I like killing people"? Okay, so let me see what else I have here. The other reason that Vallejo PD and Naval Intelligence would not have wanted the public to be aware of the fact that they had altered the cipher is that there is a general belief in the public, and you see it when police are interrogating suspects. The police are allowed to lie legally and tell a suspect that they have things that they don't actually have. The police can go in and tell during an interrogation and say, well, we have your fingerprints or we have your DNA, when they don't have that, okay? But it is not in the interest of the police that the public generally be aware of the fact that the police don't have to tell the truth, okay? And if it came out that the police had altered the cipher, that obviously would have become public. And as I said in the earlier video, Vallejo PD and Naval Intelligence didn't feel any urge to correct the cipher that was put in the newspaper for the simple reason that the plain text of the cipher had not been changed, except for some of the misspellings having been corrected. Okay, so in short, there was no reason for Vallejo PD to go back and say, oh, by the way, the cipher that we put out, that we let the newspapers publish, isn't what we actually got, okay? And it appears from the subsequent behavior of Vallejo PD, whiting out the page that had the August 1st notes on it in their police report. And the same thing with Naval Intelligence purging their records. And the same thing with the FBI withholding pages from the Zodiac killer file online. It appears that they went out of their way to keep that from becoming public. Okay, so I'm supposed to talk about Druser next. Oh, I wanted also to mention that I think I kind of touched on this earlier, where I talked about U Penn. If you read Time 17, U Penn mentions to Gareth Penn that the Zodiac killer said that police would find something interesting if they put a radian on Mount Diablo. And he said that was in the Mount Diablo letter. And I talked to Roy Conway and George Baywart back in the fall of 1991. And they really didn't give me a straight answer as far as what was in the Mount Diablo letter. I don't think the killer mentioned radians in the Mount Diablo letter. He mentioned them in the Little List letter. And it sounds like he's mentioning them for the first time. He says, the Mount Diablo code concerns radians and the inches along the radians. That sounds like he's bringing it up for the first time. And what you have to remember is that the 2 July letters, the Kathleen Johns letter, July 24th, and the Little List letter of July 26th, and also the whole card of October 5th, 1970, although that is not generally considered a Zodiac letter, I think it was. But those were kept back from being published by the newspapers. It's possible that SFPD asked the newspapers not to publish them, and they weren't published until after the Halloween card of October 27th, 1970. So from June 26th, 1970, which was when the Mount Diablo letter was sent, until after October 27th, which was when the Halloween card was mailed, there weren't any new Zodiac letters which had appeared in the newspaper. And we already know that SFPD wasn't updating the DOJ about what they were getting from the San Francisco Chronicle. So there's no reason to believe that U Penn ever saw the Little List letter, which is what Garrett describes in the book. And as I said, at no time did U Penn ever show letters to Gareth, at least not following the narrative of the book. As I said, the only time U Penn says anything was when he mentioned the use of the word radian. And when Gareth Penn is talking to Ken Narlow about the case, and he's sitting in Ken Narlow's office, every time Ken Narlow actually showed him a Zodiac letter, Gareth claims never to have seen it. So again, how U Penn could have had access to the original grid of Z408 when, as far as we can tell, Vallejo PD was keeping that under wraps, I don't know. But the DOJ seems to be the last stop on that railroad line. Napa wasn't told about it. SFPD wasn't told about it. I don't see why the DOJ would have been told about it, at least there isn't any evidence that they were. To get to what Druser asked me, he says the newspapers hadn't photographed what was originally received. Here is page 50 from the hardcover edition of Graysmith's Zodiac. After making photocopies, the newspapers arranged to have the original letters in cipher delivered to Sergeant John Lynch. The Vallejo PD in turn made copies of the code and sent them to Naval Intelligence at Mare Island Naval Shipyard for deciphering. Okay, so we know all of that. The newspapers did make photocopies according to Graysmith. I don't understand about, Druser says that the police would have had to gone to Woolworths to get the same type of paper. I really don't understand that. If Naval Intelligence was telefaxing the cipher to the FBI and CIA and NSA, it wouldn't have been on the same paper. It would have been on whatever copy paper they were using in their fax machines, right? No. I'm not completely clear on what the question is there. He says they wrote the name of the newspaper upside down. I don't really know what he's talking about there. Let's see. Oh, we know that okay, yeah, no, I already talked about that. The police labeled the cipher piece that the Chronicle published as being from the Examiner and wrote Chronicle on the piece that the Examiner published. I believe that is in what the Examiner published that Sunday. It's that was apparently was corrected. It's corrected in Graysmith's book. Okay, a third urban legend that Z408 was a fiendishly clever cipher, very difficult to solve. As Tom Boyd has pointed out, Z408 doesn't seem that hard, and it certainly wouldn't have stumped the entire Bay Area and 4 federal agencies, unless, of course, it didn't do that. I believe what happened is that Naval Intelligence in Vallejo forwarded Z408 to the FBI in Washington, which had career cryptographers, plus a mainframe computer which had a cipher program from 1962, which would have been the great-grandfather of AZ Decrypt. Donald Hardin estimated that it took him and Betty about 20 hours total to solve the cipher, mostly through trial and error, something neither of them had ever done before. So is it reasonable to assume that a team of cryptographers with a mainframe computer at FBI headquarters could have solved it in 3 or 4 hours that Friday afternoon, and then faxed it to Vallejo PD after altering the cipher grid by 22 symbols? If you go to Dave Aranchek's Let's Crack Zodiac episode 3, it mentions that Donald C.B. Marsh of the American Cryptogram Association was consulted after the Hardins mailed their solution to the SF Chronicle. Marsh was given the first 4 words of the Hardin solution, "I like killing people," and he was able to solve the entire cipher, except for the final 18 letters, in 1 hour. So if an amateur cryptographer like Marsh could solve it with a little help in 1 hour, could the FBI have solved it with a computer in 3 or 4 hours? It's important to realize that police had nothing to gain by suggesting Z408 was easy to solve. From their viewpoint, it made much more sense to suggest that the cipher was almost impossible to solve. since they were trying to get the letter writer to come forward triumphantly with a solution. Once that happened, they didn't even need the original cipher grid. All they needed was to check each solution sent to them to see if the cipher grid matched what was in the newspapers. If it didn't, the solver was the killer. Donald Hardin said he was surprised the solution was the only one that had been mailed. On page 55 of Zodiac, Graysmith points out that the Chronicle received hundreds of calls about the cipher, so it's entirely possible that the newspapers received more than one correct solution, but apparently each of those was like Hardin's in that it contained the newspaper grid. The police waited more than a week to let the newspapers publish the solution. They must have finally decided the killer wasn't going to take the bait. Again, evidence for this is Vallejo PD telling Napa's sheriff's office that the FBI solved Z408, the complete erasure of the August 1st entries in the Vallejo PD police report, Naval Intelligence purging its own records, and the absence of an image of the Z408 cipher grid in the FBI Zodiac killer files online, with a notation saying that the files had been withheld. Once the solution was published, police had nothing to gain by admitting that they'd altered the cipher grid, and from their perspective, the alterations didn't change anything, since they were either different symbols standing for the same letter or corrected misspellings from the original grid, with the animal ANAMAL exception that was apparently the result of mistaking a blank triangle for a dotted one. Although the Hardins were not even amateur cryptographers and had never solved a cipher before, it's worthwhile to review their method. They began by counting the symbols. There were 54 symbols, which means that there was more than, there were more than 2 symbols for each letter. And some of the letters just had 1 symbol, and some of them had, the letter E, for example, had 7. In other words, the writer was using more than 1 symbol for some of the letters. As Dave Aranchik points out in Fletcher Pratt's book, Secret and Urgent, this is referred to as a simple substitution cipher with suppression of frequencies, okay? The Hardins, in other words, it's 1 step above a decoder ring cipher. The Hardins expected the writer to use the word kill, since he'd used it in the cover letters, so they tried plugging in kill both for the doubled letters and for instances where the L symbols might be doubled with other L symbols yet undiscovered. They realized at one point that there were too many versions of kill, and the logical alternative was will, which gave them the symbol for W. The Hardins were doing an analog version of brute force trial and error, exactly the sort of thing that a mainframe computer like the FBI's could have done much faster. The point being that it wouldn't have taken a professional cryptographer long, using this method, to get to I like killing people, the point from which Donald Marsh was able to solve the cipher in 1 hour, and that's without use of a mainframe computer. Assuming all this is a reasonable series of assumptions, it is also reasonable to assume that the version of Z408 on page 50 of Time 17 represents the original grid. And I talked about that. If an innocent Gareth Penn did that intentionally, what did he have to gain by doing so? I can't think of any reason. The original format and the original misspellings have been preserved exactly as they were composed by the author. That's what Gareth says on page 49. I'm not sure how he would know that, by the way. That seems to suggest Gareth Penn knew that what was placed in the newspapers by police wasn't what was originally sent through the mail. if you start with what's on page 50, all the alterations the police made make sense. If Vallejo PD, if Vallejo PD or any of the newspapers involved or any of the federal agencies involved, especially the FBI, still has a photocopy of what was originally mailed on July 31st, 1969, and it matches what's on page 50 of Times 17, it will solve the case, okay? So if you ask me what my intuition is, my intuition about, I was talking to Ryan Garlick, who's a friend of Dave Aranchek's, and Ryan's a good guy. And Ryan told me several years ago, he said, I think you're overestimating how quickly the FBI could have solved the cipher. And I don't understand why Z408 is considered a difficult cipher. As I said, it's basically a simple substitution cipher, as Dave said, with the letter frequencies jumbled so that you can't use letter frequencies directly to solve it. Other than that, it's not a very difficult cipher. I don't understand why more people didn't solve it in the Bay Area, but it does seem to me as if the FBI wouldn't have had much trouble with it. And as I just pointed out, Donald Marsh doesn't seem to have had much trouble with it. So, it's like I said, ordinarily my intuition would have been, well, it's probably, for whatever reason, the FBI didn't have time to look at it. But the FBI had a motive to focus on it, which is that the newspapers were being extorted. The newspapers in the Bay Area were being extorted. So it was a federal crime. And then most of the evidence points in the direction that I'm saying, which is that we know the newspapers got the cipher. We know they gave it to Vallejo PD. We know Vallejo PD gave it to Naval Intelligence. We know Naval Intelligence forwarded it to the FBI. We know that the FBI got it because it says that right in the online file that they received the teletype on August 1st, 1969, and the word extortion is on that page. And we know from what Vallejo PD told Napa Sheriff's Office that the FBI did solve the cipher. So the only question is when they solved it. But the timing of the release of the cipher to the newspapers suggests that they solved it that afternoon. That does seem very quick to me, but again, that's what the evidence says. So, but as I try to do all the time, anytime I point to evidence is, I am open to being questioned on this, and what the simplest way of solving it is just to have the FBI release the information of what they were originally sent. Now, again, what the FBI has in its files may have been altered by the FBI, so it wouldn't necessarily, if it turns out that what the FBI has is the same thing that's in the newspapers, that wouldn't disprove what I'm saying. Now, if we could get, let's say, copies, but if what the FBI has is what Gareth Penn put in his book, then it would pretty much prove what I'm saying. The other alternative we have is if we can get the newspapers to show us what they photocopied before they gave it to Vallejo PD, that would be another way of doing it. But, I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings here, but if this is true, if what the FBI was sent is the same as what is on page 50 of Times 17, then it solves the case. And everything that you've read all these years about Arthur Lee Allen and what they talk about on Reddit every day, and all of the books, the hundreds of books that have been written about the case, really, whoever the Zodiac killer was, it's going to come down to either one person, or in my case, one group of 4 people, and everybody else is going to be wrong. Okay, so as I said, I am open to, let's find out what the FBI and the newspapers actually have, if assuming they still have the information somewhere. It might be in a banker's box in the basement of FBI headquarters, If so, let's take a look at it and see if I'm right about this. So anyway, that's the update for now. I probably went on a little bit too long here, but I'm trying to address issues. I may post these videos to Tom's board, and I may get feedback that way. If you would like to, if anyone looking at my videos on my channel would like to express an opinion, they can do that by emailing me. So, be happy to hear from anyone who has serious points to make about Z408. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching as always, and I will keep everyone updated as to any further inquiries into this matter.